7 o'clock on the dot. Okay. All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thanks for being on time. So I just wanted to very quickly introduce everybody, or they're going to introduce themselves. I wanted to introduce myself, and then everybody else will introduce themselves. So you all know me because I emailed you several times. I emailed you your parking pass if you parked on campus. So my name's Katharine Lusk. I work in the castle where we just enjoyed some lovely food and drinks together in the alumni relations office. So I work with a lot of our regional alums across the country, and I also run the sustainability alumni network. So obviously extreme heat falls under the sustainability umbrella. So I work with partners on campus and alumni around the country to put on events that, you know, fall under the sustainability umbrella to kind of educate us all, but not have it be doomsday, right? So these lovely people here are going to do just that for us tonight. So if you ever are interested in getting involved or want to put on an event in your area or want to get more involved with sustainability programming specifically, you know where to find me. You can talk to me more after the event. Okay. So I want to thank our co-sponsors as well for this event. So obviously this event is put on by the BU Alumni Association, which I work for, but we also had several co-sponsors. BU Sustainability, I know Lisa is here from that office, so thank you to Lisa. The Institute for Sustainable Energy here at BU, the Initiative on Cities, which Katharine is representing, so thank you to Katharine. And then the School of Public Health program on climate and health, which Greg Wellenius heads over here. So lots of sponsors, lots of partnerships. We love doing that across the university. So thank you to everybody. I want to also acknowledge our panelists tonight, thank them for coming and being here, as well as our moderator, Greg. So Greg, I'm gonna have you come up here now. Love to hear a little bit more about you and then everyone else as well.
All right. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you for organizing this, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. It's actually, I think this is my first, aside from class time, this is my first in-person event. So thank you all for being here. It's nice to be able to gather all together. So let me just, great. So heat is obviously related to climate change. Climate change is highly visible in the news nearly, I won't say every day, but maybe every week. We see the potential for another extreme weather event or another report coming out saying how important climate change is. And it is fantastically important, and it's also highly visible. We now have a regular stream of events like wildfires burning through the Western US and the wildfire smoke that comes from that. We have hurricanes during, you know, the late summer to fall season on the eastern half of the US. We have other severe storms. We have heat waves like the Pacific Northwest heat wave of 2021 that was just unprecedented temperatures. And these are really destructive forces of our environment. And for a long time, we talked about these things as environmental problems, and they are, and they damage our ecosystems for sure. And they sometimes damage our infrastructure, our homes, our cities, our communities. But I think the reason we really care about these things is all of that, and it affects our health and well-being. So today we're going to focus on heat specifically, but sort of as a model for the many other hazards that are increasing in frequency and severity with climate change. So heat kills an estimated 10,000 people per year in the US. So an extra 10,000 deaths that we wouldn't otherwise have if it didn't get so hot. And if you think about that, then the toll, we don't quite have a good number on it, like how many people go to the hospital, how many people go to the doctor, how many people just feel really sick. We don't have good numbers on those things yet, but it's got to be bigger than 10,000 per year if that's how many people die. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit today to try to understand the problem, understand what that actually looks like in terms of not in numbers of 10,000, but in terms of actual people's lives and how they're affected. And then I hope we can pivot a little bit to solutions and to progress, because I think it's easy to get sort of swallowed up by the doom and the gloom. And, sometimes, that's appropriate. But I think it's also really important to be really hopeful and optimistic. The climate change is a big problem, and extreme heat is a really big problem. And we have an unprecedented workforce, working on this problem, and we have an unprecedented amount of public attention to this problem. The majority of Americans acknowledge that climate change is here, that it's real, that it's caused by human activities, and that it impacts their health personally, or might. And so if there's two things I want you to take away from the evening tonight, one is that climate change is a huge problem. And it's not a problem, as one of my colleagues says from George Mason University. He says, it's not about the penguins and the polar bears and the small Pacific Islands. It's about our communities, our families, our children, and it's here, it's today. It's not at some distant time in the future. It's a very present problem. So that's one thing to realize, and I think that'll come out of the conversation today. And the other thing I wanted you to note is that this is a huge problem, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to create a better world, the world we want to leave our kids and our grandkids. And it's a world that I think is well within our reach. And you'll hear today a lot about solutions on the ground in communities, in affecting for the better the people that are most vulnerable. So with that in mind, I'd like to welcome you again and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. I neglected to introduce myself, I apologize. My name is Greg Wellenius. I am a professor of environmental health at the BU School of Public Health. I've been here for just over 2 years, came just before the pandemic. And broadly, I do epidemiology of climate effects. So by now, I think in this moment in time, most people know what an epidemiologist is. We study problems that are detectable. They're so big, they're even detectable with our data and our methods. And we can try to better understand the impacts that climate hazards are having on people's health and our well-being. So that's me, and maybe Katharine, I'll welcome you.
I was anticipating that. I just turned my mic on so everybody can hear me. Hi, everybody. My name is Katharine Lusk. I serve as the co-director of the New Initiative on Cities. We're a university-wide research center that works with the social, natural, computational, and health sciences across the EU to power research in, on, and with cities. Also create experiential learning opportunities for students across the EU. I come at this, I will probably mostly respond to questions in relation to politics. But when I talk about politics, I'm often talking about local politics. So we lead the Menino Survey of Mayors, which is the only nationally representative survey of American mayors. So every summer, I have the pleasure and privilege of doing live interviews with more than 100 mayors across the country on a whole range of issues, and taking the pulse of America's mayors on a range of topics, including climate change and heat resiliency, and a whole other range of health-related issues. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll say is just, I've been at BU for about 8 years now, and have had the pleasure of working with so many, including all these folks, so many different faculty at the university, and so many tremendous students at the university, and I think have come to appreciate the ways in which the university is at the forefront of climate-related research and also climate-related action, and is driving that both in the sort of scholarly world and on the ground, and in particular in partnership with cities. And so I'm really excited to talk about that work as well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lucy Hutyra. I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment, and I am currently the co-director of the Initiative on Cities with Katharine. And my training actually is in atmospheric sciences, and I worked in the central Amazon for most of my dissertation. That was wonderful. And I shifted when I started my faculty position here from remote places that have minimal human impact to cities, focusing on the places where there was a strong political will and need for environmental change. And most of the work that I do now is focused on greenhouse gas emissions in cities, city climate action plans, and thinking about how do we reduce emissions and get on a more sustainable pathway. And in the last few years, I've started to do a lot of work on heat and heat in cities and how we can mitigate and solve some of the acute issues that we have in cities, especially through vegetation and things like changing the surface characteristics of the city. So I bring the physical sciences to this panel. And thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right.
I just want to say that I don't normally have such great posture, but these chairs encourage it. So I'm going to sit up. I'm Madeline Scammell. I'm an associate professor of environmental health at the School of Public Health. I teach community engaged research, and most of my research, my own personal compass is guided by questions that come from community members, people on the ground, mostly dealing with frontline environmental injustices. And I want my research to be informed by that. And I got into studying heat by responding to a concern among workers in Central America who were suffering from chronic kidney disease. And we know acute renal failure is associated with extreme heat events, but chronic kidney disease isn't, as far as we know, and what is causing this disease. So I started monitoring heat among workers and have learned quite a bit about heat exposure and heat stress in an occupational setting, and just prior to the pandemic, brought some of that home and started looking at heat in my own backyard in the cities of Chelsea and Boston, where I live and work.
That's great. Thank you. Ian.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Suwing. I'm professor of Earth and Environment. Hutyra is my departmental colleague. I guess I'm the old guy here. I've been here since 2002. I grew up academically across the river in the factory at MIT. Where I was very lucky and privileged to do my PhD in the joint program of science and policy of global change. And it has been wonderful for me because I've been able to continue working from almost seamlessly from my graduate education to continue working on climate change. I'm an economist. I focus on climate change impacts and adaptation and its effect on not just the economy broadly, and not just on markets, but on human behavior. And I am fundamentally motivated, if you can hear the accent. I'm motivated by the fact that I am from Trinidad, which is one of those small island states. It also happens to be the second largest natural gas exporter in the Western Hemisphere. Lots of gas deposits on the outer continental shelf. I think that's something like the 15th largest deposits of natural gas in the world. And so here we have my homeland, which, suppose the world does do something about climate change and we reduce emissions and we relieve ourselves of the burden of using fossil fuels, my compatriots starve. If we don't, steric expansion of sea height means that the oceans will rise and where I live will sink beneath the waves. So we'll drown. There's no way to win this. It's like Danny DeVito in War of the Roses. And this is a classic economist's cost minimization problem. You have costs here, you have costs there. What do you need to do to find solutions to navigate? So that's kind of what I think about. And I would say that there are lots of things we can do, lots of things we should do, lots of things that we aren't doing. And so I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I want to point out two things. One is that the diversity of talent and expertise and disciplinary backgrounds that we have on this panel is unusual even amongst academic circles. So I just want to call that out and thank you all for participating today and actually for your ongoing collaboration from about 6 months before I came to BU. The second thing is that I love that we're in person. One of the advantages about in person is that we can have a back and forth dialogue on this. So we'll start with a couple questions that get the conversation going, and then I'm going to invite you all to chime in and make this an engaged conversation. So start thinking about what it is you want to hear from this panel of wonderful experts. So Madeline, I want to start with you. I mentioned this number of 10,000 people might die per year in the US due to heat. many more suffer. Numbers are great, but what does suffering from heat, what does being in a community that's vulnerable or less resilient to heat actually look like? You've been in the community. Tell us a bit about that.
Thanks, Greg. Well, I thought it depends on where you are. Of course, what community? Trinidad is not Chelsea. So it looks different depending on where you are. But I'll speak from where I'm from. And I was a graduate student while living in the city of Chelsea in 2006 at BU. I'm in Milan. And it's July 2006. Until 2020, the hottest season on record in New England. It was a heat wave. I lived on the 3rd floor of a brick building, an old building, like many 3-story buildings in my neighborhood. And it was hot, like so hot. And at night, with no air conditioning, the windows are open. You can hear the neighbor's baby screaming like it's in your own bedroom. I can hear the kids playing at the parking lot of the funeral home across the street. I'm listening to the radio, fireworks. I'm trying to sleep. I desperately need sleep. I can't. Then the cops come, then the blue lights that fill your bedroom, and you should get up and start dancing because it's a freaking disco, and you're trying to sleep and you're hot. And then the alarm goes off and you have to get up and you go to work. And I'm lucky. I had an air-conditioned office at BU. I go downstairs. I wait at the bus stop. It's so hot, there's no shade. The bus is late. I always bring a sweater because my mother always said, no matter what the weather, if you live in New England, you travel with a sweater. But if you travel on the bus, you know you're either gonna freeze or you're gonna be so hot in the summertime. So then you get to school and you fall asleep at your desk because you can finally rest and air conditioner. And then you go home and you pass the people waiting in line outside for food because there's so much food insecurity. It didn't start with the pandemic. And they're carrying heavy boxes home in the same sidewalks that have no tree shade. And then the whole thing happens over and over, and violence upticks. Violent crimes increase during heat waves. You can't think, poor cognition, more injuries on the job. And then the hospitalizations due to a number of health problems that would happen anyway, but they're more likely to happen during extreme heat events. And it was the summer of 2006 that my own dad died of a heart attack with no risk factors that we knew of. And it didn't occur to me until 2020. I wonder if heat had to do with that. So I think that the heat is called a silent killer because unless we work in a setting where we're trained to recognize the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, we don't know what it feels like. And then it hits you and it can be deadly. Heat stroke can be deadly. And I think all of us are becoming more familiar with that, but not enough, not soon enough, I would say. So that's just a glimpse from on the ground.
Oh, thank you for sharing that personal experience. And so, Katharine, if I can pivot to you, what do you think, at the policy level in the, whether we're thinking of mayors or in smaller communities, government leaders, how important an issue is climate change broadly, heat specifically, and how have you seen that change over time?
Yeah. So a couple of facts. I'll start with a couple of facts. So we know from our surveys that 84% of mayors believe climate change or understand that climate change is due to human activities. So that actually puts them ahead of the general public. So about 60% of Americans, asking them exactly the same question, will state that they agree. And this has remained constant actually over time. But 60% of Americans will say that they understand that climate change is due to human activity. So that's one point. Is generally in City Hall, in cities across the country, mayors who are responsible for the majority of the US population, because the majority of us actually live in urban environments, understand that there's this relationship between the actions of the private sector, of us as individuals, even their own sort of municipal fleets and their own actions in government, between all of those things and what's actually happening in climate. The second data point is that mayors have been surveyed around the types of the sort of frequency, severity, and duration of extreme weather events. And there's two that top the list. And they say, where mayors will say that we agree that we're seeing increased severity, frequency, and duration of flooding and extreme sort of, weather-related events and rain, and heat. And heat is actually the second one. But there's a lot of heterogeneity in cities across the country. And Greg, you and I know we just did an event on this with folks from, the resiliency officer from New York City and the resiliency officer, the heat officer in Phoenix, Arizona. And the guy in Phoenix was new to the job. It's unfathomable to me that in the city of Phoenix, for the very first time right now, they would actually have a chief heat officer. But they've been living with heat for a lot longer than the rest of us have been living with heat. And so their buildings, right, their environments, their schools are air conditioned, their apartment buildings are air conditioned, their offices are air conditioned, their cars are air conditioned, sort of all of these things that sort of most people, the spaces most people go into in their everyday life, are able to adapt and give them the sort of cooling that they need so their bodies can adapt to living in a hot climate. But we have been slower to do that in parts, in places like New England. Unless a few of our buildings, none of our schools have air conditioning, fewer of these environments where most of us spend, certainly where my kids spend every day, have not actually been conditioned for the increased frequency, severity, and duration of extreme heat events. And so while there's broad recognition that this is a challenge, I would say some places require a dramatically different level of adaptation, a dramatically different level of investment as they catch up and begin to sort of respond and take action to these new and emerging threats.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point that in 2021 was the appointment of the first chief heat officer anywhere in the world. I believe that was in Miami or Miami-Dade County, with Phoenix, I think, being second, close behind. And it's right. I mean, this is an issue that is not entirely new, and yet there hasn't been a focal person in city government whose sort of job it is to, mitigate those health impacts. So, we already mentioned a little bit about air conditioning. So is the solution here just give everybody air conditioning and, we should just sort of, give them away or sell them cheaper? Talk to us about air conditioning and why that can't be the complete solution.
Well, it's a transitory solution, which is good. So it turns out that there's a lot of evidence that violent behaviors associated with exposure to heat. There's evidence that individuals just feel worse. Their transitory well-being is dramatically lowered by exposure to, let's say, a 90-degree day. And there's also emerging evidence that AC can be protective of health. And so my father-in-law, who lives in Cambridge, he's like, I have died in the war New Englander. I have an air conditioner, but I never turn it on. And we're like, no, please turn it on. You're 85. Please turn it on. And so I think we have access to cooling, we should use it. The problem is the extensive margin of people who don't have access. And it turns out that it's the very places that don't have a very, very high prevalence of air conditioning because they have not heretofore been the cities that have been exposed to a lot of extreme heat. But when you look at what climate models say, if you believe them, they are going to dramatically have lots of increased heat towards 2050. And the mantra is, think of the hottest summer you've ever experienced by the middle of the century, 2060, that's going to be every summer. And so there are a lot of places that aren't prepared. Yes, one could argue that you have higher levels of AC penetration, but the United States has some of the highest AC penetration of any place in the world. My colleagues in University of Venice study air conditioning across the world, and the United States is very much an outlier. Never group the United States with other countries because it messes up the statistics. We are way off the charts. But even so, if you look within cities, Black and brown folks, poor folks, folks without much education, who predominantly live in the urban core can have systematically less air conditioning access than folks who are in the suburbs. So here we get into an issue of it's not just generally AC, but even around us, there are disparities in access. And so in the short run, how do you provide for folks? I don't think it's good enough to just give away air conditioning. I think municipalities are focused on solutions for early warning, for providing cooling havens, for general outreach and public health education. Beyond that, it's a bit of a conundrum, because one thing we also know about increased penetration of AC in the warming world is that you also get higher utilization of AC and higher use of electricity. And what keeps me up at night is, how do we generate that electricity? If we are adapting to climate change and we choose to generate the additional energy we need to adapt with fossil fuels that make the climate worse, that's not a good dynamic. That's a positive feedback loop. And so I think the solution has to be on many levels simultaneously. It has to be systemic. It cannot be hand-out air conditioners. You've got to think about grid modernization. You've got to think about the role of renewables, the role of storage, the role of smart grid management. You've got to think about behavior, the use of buildings that are kept cool for the purposes of providing the public health benefits of cooling. Because we're cooling down lots of buildings in the very urban core where they're needed, but they don't, right? And so they could be, we don't necessarily need to have more air conditioning or more electricity use. We could find behavioral ways of providing access. And so this is the sort of economy story that behavior needs technology for life.
I like that, and thinking about a comprehensive package of solutions. So Lucy, I know you do a lot of work on so-called nature-based solutions, as well as other sort of population-wide solutions. So tell us a bit about those, and do those solutions work, or maybe when and where do they work?
Sure, but I can't help but add one.
Yeah,
thing to
please.
what Ian said. The air conditioning has another negative or positive feedback on the system, negative impact, which is using that air conditioning will cool the inside of the building, but produce waste heat outside the building, making the problem locally fundamentally worse. So it's not just the greenhouse gas emissions that power those air conditioners, which is a global problem. It's a local problem of the waste heat right outside the room that you cool.
Let me push you on that though a little bit. So like, is that a theoretical problem, or is that like you actually can measure that?
Measurable, absolute problem.
Okay.
In some cities, in some parts of the city, there's so much anthropogenic waste heat associated with industrial activities, air conditioning, cars, that it's almost the amount of energy coming from the sun. It's not true everywhere.
Sure.
On average, it's maybe 0.5% or so in a city of the waste heat compared to what the sun is providing for energy, but in spots, it's huge. And if you're in the wrong spot, it's absolutely terrible. But air conditioning is part of the solution. It just can't be the whole solution. Nature-based solutions are being very widely discussed now because of all the problems with air conditioning. So what is a nature-based solution? There's a whole range of them. You can see the trees that are about to have leaves on them outside. Those are probably one of the biggest nature-based solutions that's talked about from a climate perspective. And what plants do is they take water from the ground in a liquid form, take it through the plant, and in the process of doing photosynthesis, which is what I kind of grew up studying, they lose water. So they are leaking water. They're taking liquid water, and then they're releasing it as a gas. When it goes from liquid to gas, it consumes heat and it actively cools. So it works. There's absolutely no doubt that trees will cool the city. They'll cool the city through kind of the physics of that water dynamic, but they'll also shape the city. So they'll reduce how much sunlight actually hits the ground and how much the surfaces heat up and they re-radiate heat later. The challenge with nature-based solutions is you have to have a place to put it. So you actually, in your urban fabric, have to have a space to plant the trees, and there has to be water for the trees. So in a city like Phoenix, that's a challenge. Trees as a nature-based solution to excess heat in Phoenix is a poor strategy because they don't have the water to support the trees. So they'll spend a lot of money and potentially get nice PR about this green solution that they can't support. So in some cities, that solution is not a viable solution. And in other cities, in a city like Boston, it's an easy solution. Our rainfall is about equal across the year. We don't necessarily have to irrigate for things to survive, especially deep-rooted trees. And they have enough water. And the future forecasts for what will happen with precipitation is an intensity of summer rain, but there's still going to be ample water in this region. So trees in a place like this are a great nature-based solution. Boston has about 27% canopy cover. So if you look from the sky down, about 27% of the ground would be covered by trees. It could be higher. But in some of, and you could get cooling from that without having to modernize the grid or all the things that Ian talked about. But in some places like Chelsea or East Boston, which is where some of the most heat vulnerable populations live, the solution would be hard to implement because you need to have space for the trees. And in those places you could rip up pavement, but if it's house to house, very high density, it's a challenge. Another solution is changing what the physical property of this, the reflective, absorptive properties of the city look like. So things like white sidewalks or white roofs. These are very low-tech solutions. And in some cities like Sacramento actually is the brightest city I've ever seen because their roads are not black. It's just they've chosen to pave in a different way than we have, and their roofs are all white because it's hot, and they already knew that if they did that, the city would just be cooler. Boston is one of the darkest cities, and it's an easy solution. It's an inexpensive solution that will just reflect the heat away, rather than having it absorb into the walls and the roads and re-radiate so that Madeline can't sleep at night, which is when the heat island is the worst, and all that heat is coming back out. So some of these solutions will work beautifully in some places and terribly in other places. So it's something that really needs to be considered on a place-by-place basis. But there's a lot of things that we can do that are not just air conditioning, although air conditioning, I feel, has to be part of the solution.
That's great, thank you. So Katharine, these solutions take a long time and they take money and political will and organization. And, you know, in Boston, we've had 3 mayors in about a year. So, you know, how do we, what's the political strategy, or what's the, you know, executive branch strategy, not politics, sort of capital P, but what's the executive branch strategy for putting into place long-term solutions that require long-term planning and long-term investments when you're up for re-election in a couple of years?
That's when I say government is necessary but not sufficient. I mean, you know, I mean, it's such a good question, and it's and you could pick heat, but you could pick any topic, right? You could, I mean, climate adaptation and the waterfront, sea level rise, putting in bike infrastructure, which is like sort of this, everyone wants it, but then nobody wants it. It's like this political hot button in Boston. So part of the answer is that we're seeing cities undertake massive planning processes, right? To say, how do we actually look at, how do we combine the array of solutions? How do we overlay that set of solutions to not just sort of the region of the country we're in, but the heterogeneity within the city itself? So the variation in neighborhoods and the vulnerability that exists in individual neighborhoods and individual census tracts and individual blocks How do we actually get down to that really sort of granular level so that we're making, we're able to pinpoint, knowing that widespread transformation is needed, we're able to pinpoint resources to the areas that need it the most. And that's part of that inevitable allocation of scarce dollars, right? Is that we actually have to hone in on where are we really going to focus our efforts. The benefits of city planning is that you've got your annual operating budget, and then you've got your capital plan. And your capital plan can be done over 5 or 10 years. And kind of once you get all the different departments in and they weigh in, this is sort of the sort of wonky, not very interesting stuff. But the capital plan means that you have this long-term strategy to say, here's the pot of money, here's where we know our priorities are, these are the neighborhoods we're going to put it in, and then this is the time horizon over which we're going to make these investments. And then you have an election. And a whole bunch of institutional knowledge has happened right now, walks out the door. And two things matter in that instance. One thing that matters is mayors themselves will say, I just want to give a shout out to civil servants. We don't give enough credit to civil servants, people who actually make their jobs, not just as politicians, but actually make their careers in local government. And I say that to students as often as I can, because it's an incredible opportunity. I worked for the late Mayor of Boston, Tom Menino, and you will never have a more rewarding job, frankly, than working in local government. And there's plenty of people who make that their career. And so a certain level of folks in any government, federal government, state government, city government, leave with a new administration. And then there's a whole legion of folks who stick around. And so we need to be grateful to those people who stick around and keep some institutional knowledge in government. And then I think the second thing in relation to sort of these heat plans and the capital plans and all of these long-term priorities is the role of citizens and the role of advocacy organizations and all the other partners that sit outside of government who have sustained pressure, right? And so what do? They make issues, election issues. They put mayors in the hot seat or mayoral candidates in the hot seat and say, tell me what you're going to do. Tell me what you're going to do about climate change. Tell me what you're going to do for my neighborhood, and tell me when you're going to do it. And that's what's happened right now with Mayor Wu. She made climate change one of the sort of cornerstones of her platform. And there's a whole bunch of people who are going to hold her accountable for trying to deliver on those promises. And it will certainly come back to bear next time she's up for re-election.
Yeah.
And the last piece that we sort of forget about, in addition to sort of voters and advocacy organizations, is in a place like Boston, the role of other partners. And that could be the role of the private sector. That could be the role of major institutions like the U, right? The U is a climate leader. We're part of the Green Ribbon Commission. Our president goes out and says, we need investment in climate mitigation, climate adaptation strategies. Our corporations are at the forefront of pushing City Hall around those investments. And our foundations are at the forefront of pushing City Hall around those investments. And certainly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of those different forces outside of government coalesce, and a much greater recognition that there needs to be intentional long-term investment in climate adaptation, climate mitigation strategies. We are still in, if anyone paid attention during the last presidential administration, when the prior presidential administration pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords, we are still in. It was a coalition of mayors, of governors, of corporate CEOs, of foundation leaders, of university presidents, of this whole other apparatus and all of these other institutional actors in our country who said, no, we're still going to follow through. We're still going to adhere to these commitments on behalf of our government, even if our government is saying that we're not going to do them. And so I think that's what's exciting if you're in this space now, is you see all of these different forces coming together, and then all the way back down to the city level, you see citizens, you see corporations, you see universities, you see advocacy organizations continuing to kind of maintain that pressure so folks follow through on those investments.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, all the hope, the hope I mentioned at the beginning is in fact that so much action does happen at the local level. Like, I don't know if you can quantify the percent, but sort of globally, like almost nothing happens, and federally in the US, very little happens, and then like locally, so much happens in each of our cities and towns, part of the solution, and seemingly eager to do so. So I want to open it up to you, the audience, for questions. If there's something you want to bring to the table here, either a comment or a question. Yeah, please. You can either stand up or there's a microphone can come around.
Hi, my name is Rohini. I'm a student at BUSPH in the EH department. So I'm just thinking a little bit about Redline Communities, which have the most urban heat islands, and thinking about your point about tree canopy and green space. Is there, if any, like any pushback from community members when trying to incorporate things like that? I can only imagine them, you know, these community members kind of feeling iffy about people coming in and just changing up their community. And so I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to that.
Great.
You should have come to my class on Tuesday. Entirely devoted to redlining and environmental justice in the ecology of cities. It's a huge issue. And it's a huge challenge because many nature-based solutions, many environmental improvements in the amenities and quality of the environment in some of the most impacted and disadvantaged communities, when you improve it, those communities can't afford to live there anymore because the competition for real estate is, they have made it appealing for further development, gentrification, and huge community displacement. And it's not a theoretical concern, it is a real concern. It's not an academic discussion, it's a discussion that community groups are very well aware of. And it's an enormous double-edged sword of you want to do something to address the disparities and the injustices, but when you do, you may perpetuate them. The solution to this problem, maybe Madeline will give a better answer to, but it's really, really hard. I was involved with a project in 2020 on a transportation redevelopment along the Mia Cass. And that redevelopment really brought home for me how it was 100 trees that were going to be removed in this area in order to plant hundreds more, in order to improve flooding, improve air quality, improve traffic, and deal with one of the most dangerous sections of road in the state of Massachusetts. And in a couple of years, the environmental quality in that area would have been better. But in the short term, it was going to be a removal of trees that had a huge historic legacy to that community from when a highway was going to be built through that area. And this was the state's accommodation to basically leveling the neighborhood. And though it meant so much to that community, 100 trees stopped the $26 million transportation improvement that was going to improve the quality. But the engagement with the community, the discussion about how, where, when, and what safeguards were going to be put in place to help keep those families there didn't happen, to the point where the entire project was canceled, and it will be years before a real problem is tackled. But it was this redlining, it was the fear of gentrification and displacement, it was all of that wrapped up together. It's very real and a terribly difficult problem to solve. So Madeline, you have the solution?
I would just say that I think in my experience, the trees have come at the demand of residents who say they want them, and it's a solution that hasn't come easy for many.
But it's hard because there's also a lot of do-gooder organizations that I often hang out with those organizations where it's very exciting to attend a tree planting ceremony and plant trees all across the city. What is less exciting, going back to municipal budgeting, is paying to maintain those trees and not end up with a neighborhood full of dead trees that you've got the newspaper headlines for the environmental improvement at one point and never followed up. Detroit has a terrible challenge in this where there are so many organizations that want to do greening in this area, but there's a distrust, there's an earned distrust of the follow through to keep the environmental amenities flowing with these improvements.
I just want to say quickly too that, just very quickly, to comment on Lucy's point about green gentrification. When we talk to mayors about this, they understand that, there needs to be, when you're making, particularly when you're making massive investments like in a new park, not just fruit trees, but like a massive new green investment that really makes a neighborhood more desirable. You have to couple it with homeownership programs, with affordable housing and the preservation of existing affordable housing. And sometimes with things like land banking, where if it's maybe not a desirable neighborhood right now, the city's actually buying up and preserving land in anticipation of rising property values, because they plan to be able to build more affordable housing in that neighborhood. And so some mayors, not all of them, actually probably relatively few of them, understand that when you're making huge investments in something that makes a neighborhood more desirable, you need complementary investments that allow people to stay in those homes, or in the future have an eye for how you're going to maintain diverse income, diversity of incomes and households within that neighborhood as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Great question. Okay, yeah, right behind you. There.
Just on that issue of the maintenance of trees, I remember a couple of summers ago being in Spain and watching these electric water trucks literally ride down that, and there was someone whose job it was to water the trees. I also remember a grassroots effort in our own neighborhood where we were supposed to adopt a gator bag and be the one who was supposed to do that. And I was happy to do that. I'm taking my little cat litter filled things off of the rain barrel, wheeling them over to the thing and filling up the thing because there's no hose nearby. I mean, it's like the difference between an organized, an organized response versus a volunteer effort. And it just, I don't know the underlying numbers, but when you look at not just the financial, near-term financial costs, but the PR costs of well-intended initiatives, then falling prey to neglect like that, it just is it lack of political will? Is it education? And why that's, I'm picking on one solution, but I mean, it's just indicative of a number of other good systemic solutions that strike me as eminently feasible. And I just don't understand why we aren't able to rally the kind of political will to institute them. That's a very general lament, but
I mean, I would say one thing is it's easy to accept a free tree and put the tree in the ground, and that's the least of your worry, right? The cost of the tree is the sort of most minimus part of the cost of the tree.
right.
And so part of it is actually even having, if you're a city with scarce resources and you say, well, I'm a mayor with an ambitious goal, I'm going to plant 100,000 trees, or I'm going to plant 1 million trees. That's the thing that you're focused on. But really what you need to be focused on, and what advocacy organizations and civil servants need to maintain emphasis on, is what's the maintenance contract for the tree, right? And so what if whoever you gave the contract to plant 1,000 trees, let's say, what's the lifespan? So is it 3 years? Is it 5 years where they have to have replacement if that tree dies? And then is the company that put the tree in, are they then responsible for coming back and watering it to get it to a point where it actually can thrive on its own? I mean, Lucy's also done a lot of work around things like gas leaks. Are we actually putting trees in places where the tree is inevitably going to die and it's never going to thrive in those locations? In which case, it's a lousy financial decision to keep putting the tree back there. So some of that is you sort of need the knowledge, and then you need to put pressure on politicians that the political will is not to put the 100,000 trees in. The political will is to actually have a citywide master plan for tree canopy and a goal for how you're going to expand tree canopy. And it's not the easy tick the box of actually of a simple number.
So one thing I learned from Katharine years ago, I'm still learning from Katharine regularly, but one of the things I learned was there's a lot of copycats when it comes to innovation in cities. And cities copy each other with policies that work. And a policy, like I said, in Phoenix, Boston's policy in Phoenix would not work. And if in Spain, you're seeing bucket trucks have to be, it's seeing this massive carbon footprint associated with keeping these trees alive. they did something wrong. They maybe chose the wrong species of trees. They chose the wrong location of trees. They chose a place where the soils were wrong to be able to support that. And the net impact, the net climate impact of their nature-based solution, their climate solution is probably making the climate worse. And Los Angeles is actually a great example. Los Angeles followed New York City in setting a goal of planting 1 million trees. New York City achieved its goals, and they're talking now about planting another 1 million trees in New York. In Los Angeles, trees will not survive without irrigation. Period. They're all irrigated in order to survive. Los Angeles was wise enough to abandon its goal of planting 1 million trees because it was the wrong solution for Los Angeles, because they were going to have trees competing with people for water. And it was going to just cause a whole cascade of problems because they followed another city's lead, but they were smart enough to see it was the wrong solution. And a lot of the cities don't have the resources to know what the right trees are to plant, or how do trees interact with air pollution. It turns out they do dramatically. If you plant the wrong tree, you can make air pollution acutely worse, or you can make it better. But people often think about, well, what color are the flowers on this tree in the spring, rather than thinking about some of these secondary effects.
Great. Please.
So what's the answer in LA? I have granddaughters there, so I'm really.
So I think in a place like LA, I think and Phoenix is another example.
Yeah.
Is thinking about what kind of landscaping they have and thinking about the water efficiency of that landscaping. And in a place so that they are using water more wisely, because people need water too. California, of course, the largest consumer of water in California is agriculture, not the cities, but that's a side topic. And in a place like Los Angeles, doing something like changing the reflectivity of the city. Do you need lawns? Lawns are dark and they need water. Well, what if we put in rock gardens with strategic plantings that had timed irrigation? That would change the color of the city. Changing the color of the city and changing how it reflects and absorbs heat is a super efficient way of dealing with the heat problem. And in many respects, it's a lower cost way. Roofs, if you paint them white, they turn gray eventually and have to be repainted. Like anything, there's a maintenance dimension to it, but it needs to be the right solution for the right place.
And decarbonizing.
Yes,
Well,
actually.
Yeah.
But also this, part of the problem is that there are not political incentives for the volunteer. It does not make good political sex appeal to say, well, I maintain the village, rather than 1 million trees. But there's been lots of work that's been ignored by economists that have tried to focus on incentives. Can we create incentive-based structures with public-private partnerships to provide those services? Is there a way to monitor, to say, well, all your trees are dying, so no, you're not going to get the money unless you make it so the trees are alive? How can you design and ink and enforce better sorts of contractual arrangements? These kind of behavioral, not necessarily tree focused, but systemic solutions that are focused on the fact that many of these services and many of the benefits of these services will be provided by nonprofits, they will be provided by private entities, and anybody with a budget is going to respond, at least at some basic level, to financial incentives. What are those? How do they work? How can we design the mechanisms to achieve the outcomes that we desire?
We have a question from some. We can hear you.
We hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Perfect.
We have a question that came in from the live stream from Susan. She asks to the panel, how could no-till farming contribute to minimizing heat emissions? Does any department at BU study or address this issue?
No-till farming. I'm not.
I do some work on agriculture, but it can potentially do so in a roundabout manner, to the extent that no-till or low-till tends to be paired with other management innovations in agriculture that avoid using nitrogenous fertilizers. Nitrogenous fertilizers, creating them is hugely energy intensive, and the fertilizer itself is basically applying fossil fuel to the land surface. And so it's usually associated with a lot of organic agriculture. Organic agriculture tends to have a lower carbon footprint. The catch is that organic agriculture tends not to be used for staples or calorie crops. So wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, 75% of the world's calories, what we use for dietary energy. Right? They tend to be used for high value tree-based species like almonds. Almonds is the most expensive crop in the world.
Particularly water dependent.
And particularly, yes, indeed, particularly water demanding. And so because these more natural-based solutions tend to not rely on something like fertilizer, which is cheap and very carbon intensive, they can typically be supported by very high value agriculture, not commodity agriculture. And so you don't see a very, very high penetration in the thing that literally puts bread on our table. So yes,
Supported by the federal government.
well, that's a whole other issue because
That's the next panel.
That's the other panel, which is just a misalignment of political incentives with financial goals. But what you don't see is these measures being broadly adopted. The one area where there are incentives to put them in is the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, where individual farmers develop reserve contracts as to how to furlough their land, how to use no or low till, develop projects, bid them in. And that's an example of an instrument that a lot of environmental economists have studied. It's called payments to ecosystem services.
Wonderful.
So no-till agriculture is a great solution for many problems, but not heat directly, I'd say. It will change the greenhouse gas emissions on a long-term global basis, but it's not going to affect local heat problems.
All right, great. I want to, we're almost out of time, so I want to come to each of you and ask you either for a recent success story in this area or a reason for hope. And because I'd like to end on a positive note. So Madeline, I'll start with you.
Hey. Yeah, I had a conversation with the director of housing and community development in my city this morning, and I feel hopeful because people like Alex Kane are working to create a carbon neutral grid, and that's what we're going to have to do ultimately. And I think people are doing that across the country and the world, and I could stand more, but I'll pass it on.
Ian.
It's actually the same point. I think since 2012, we've had a 30% reduction in coal-fired electric generation capacity across the nation, and not much more substitution of natural gas for that. And I think that has dramatically reduced emissions of the United States power sector, and it has not had a measurable impact, at least as far as the economists I talked to, on power prices. And so it's reason for hope that we can actually wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, even as we enter a phase of civilization where we simultaneously have to figure out how to reduce emissions and adapt to the heat that we've already committed ourselves to. But I think we can do it.
Great. Lucy.
I'm optimistic because we're having conversations like this in the first place. And we're talking about the nuances of air conditioning and the grid and community access to have an air conditioner, turn on an air conditioner and pay the electricity bill associated with it versus these other trade-offs. And in the last few years, the conversation has become so much more nuanced and engaging different kinds of thinkers and actors and thinking about the multidimensional challenges. So, 5 years ago, these conversations were not happening, and they are now.
Great.
And I share that reason for optimism, that I see these same conversations, not as quite as wonky, Not the same statistics, but the same conversations happening in rooms of mayors, and that they're happening in rooms of mayors globally. They're happening locally. They're happening regionally, nationally. That there is a tremendous amount of political will for climate action, and that's a recent phenomenon. And that they really feel a true sense of agency, that there are action steps that they can take. And I would also say that sometimes the political divisiveness, I don't want to end on politics, but the political divisiveness we sometimes see around things like climate change. One of the things we've also looked at is that actually Republican mayors are taking action on climate, but they're not using the phrase climate change, which is politically charged still in this country. They're calling it resiliency. And heat is an area where a tremendous amount of resiliency and adaptation planning is required. And so when you see the political will, we see the political will at the local level across the political spectrum. And I think, and we also see not only climate action planning happening, but increasingly climate action planning in partnership with communities and with much more of an equitable lens to understand the disproportionate harm that's being caused in neighborhoods of color and the need for overinvestment and renewed investment in more vulnerable neighborhoods in particular. And so I think all of that gives me cause for hope.
Wonderful. Thank you. I like all those messages. I would echo that although these are big problems, there's lots of work and lots of success and progress on solutions. And I think that translates back to my opening remarks that this is a good example of these big problems around the hazards related to climate change, how they all have this level of, we're further along on heat than on some other measures, but that this is a good example of how hard problems can be solved. We can make progress. We can make people's lives better. We can create a better world for our kids and our grandkids. And we'll keep working on that. So thank you all for being here. We'll hang out for a few minutes afterwards. So if you have questions that you didn't get answered in public, we're happy to stick around and answer them. And Corinne, thank you so much for having us.
Let's give them a great round. Thank you so much, everybody. I just have a few final remarks. I meant to say this earlier, and you can kind of see it underneath everyone's heads. But we planned this program around Earth Day. We wanted to do it on Earth Day to kind of get you in the mindset of, global issues, but Earth Day fell during public school vacation week. So we chose to do it this week, but now you're a week ahead. So you're ahead of the game. You're starting to think about these issues a week ahead of time. So clearly, a wide variety of perspectives and disciplines were presented to you all today, but I think it kind of shows how sustainability is not just one thing. It's not just one area that creates the problem or solves the problem, right? So there's lots of different worlds kind of coming together. And I think you can see that from the professors up here today, their disciplines and the research that they do. So thank you all so much again. Quick shout out. During the pandemic, my team launched a online networking platform called BU Connects. Sustainability has its own page and group with hundreds of alums. So if you're interested in learning more about sustainability events or entertainment events, real estate events, we've got all these different groups. So I would encourage all of you to join if you're interested. If you have questions, I can tell you more about that. But even if you just Googled tonight, BU Connects, you can sign up with your LinkedIn profile. Super easy. Another way for you to connect with us online. And speaking of, it was so great to be with you in person tonight, but we also do events virtually still. We're going to kind of go to this hybrid model that the world is sort of evolving to. So to see all that we're doing, whether it's in Boston online or other areas in the country or the world that you may find yourselves in, feel free to always keep an eye on our events calendar, which you can find at bu.edu/alumni/events. And, if you got the email invitation for this event, I'd say you're in good shape. So we've got your email and you'll hear about all the good things that we're doing. So again, if you have any questions, just come talk to me. I'm happy to help in any way. And thank you so much again. And thank you to these guys.